Good evening. It was a state funeral in all but name, and a deeply Christian funeral in every sense. In the course of it, the Bishop of London recalled the day a quarter of a century ago when Margaret Thatcher came to Edinburgh to explain to the assembled Church of Scotland how the gospel shaped her political thinking. The Sermon on the Mound, as it was dubbed, was controversial then, and remains so to this day.
We come to this cathedral today to remember before God Margaret Hilda Thatcher.
Have I discovered joy within myself, or am I still looking for it in externals, outside myself? Margaret Thatcher had a sense of this, which she expressed in her address to the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland, when she said, "I leave you with the earnest hope that may we all come nearer."
That may we all come nearer to that other country, whose ways are ways of gentleness, and all her paths are peace.
Well, I'm joined now by the Reverend Johnson Mackay, a former head of BBC Scotland religious programmes, who was at that General Assembly meeting 25 years ago. What's your memory of it?
My memory of it is of the General Assembly, which is a very courteous body, being extremely courteous in listening to what Mrs. Thatcher, as she then was, said, but I suspect 2/3 of those who were present A, would have disagreed with her, and B, would have voted against her.
But they'd give her a round of applause, I believe, at the end, didn't they?
Well, they're courteous. They give her a round of applause.
But there's a bit of, just been talking on Newsnight about the myth-making and why do we have these rituals, but there's been a bit of myth-making here about that event, hasn't there? Because the pictures presented now is that, there are these furious and indignant members of the Church of Scotland subjected to this harangue, but it wasn't like that at all,
well,
was it?
that certainly is not my recollection of it, and I was there as a BBC journalist, and my recollection of it was that they listened to her in polite silence, and at the end of her speech applauded her fairly roundly, and off it went. It was, well, it happened.
The other thing, I don't know whether it's myth-making or not, but is this idea, and I heard it repeated on the television the other night, that at that time, because there was no Scottish Parliament, somehow or other the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland was viewed as a sort of surrogate parliament. I mean, surely most people in Scotland in the late 1980s, that would have been the furthest thing from their minds.
That was constantly said, but it was never said by anybody, to my knowledge, in the Church of Scotland. It was the sort of thing which journalists, lazy journalists, liked to say, because the Church of...
But it's now become common currency. So you reckon it was invented by the newspapers retrospectively?
Well, it was the sort of thing, because the Church of Scotland had a Church and Nation Committee, which had a day in those days which debated heaven and earth and all creation, then people got the impression that this was somehow the nearest thing to a Scottish Parliament, and that was, I have to say, constantly repeated by politicians who came to the Assembly and said, you are the nearest thing we have to a Scottish Parliament. Your debates are far better than those in Parliament. Then God help us for what Parliament must have been like. But that's how the myth was created.
Right. Now, look, putting your Reverend's hat on for a minute. What did you make of today? I mean, they've just been discussing whether it was obviously quite a deeply Christian ceremony, wasn't it?
I thought it was a very Christian ceremony. Am I supposed to say that I didn't think that was a good idea?
No, of course I don't expect you to say it. I'm just curious as to, for example, whether you thought the quasi-state nature of it was appropriate, the quasi-military aspect of it was appropriate, or whether it would have been... I mean, I think everyone who I've heard today was quite impressed by the more strictly religious bits of it.
Well, I had grave reservations about the military and the state aspect of it, though I thought there was bound to be a degree of state aspect there. I found it very impressive. I watched the whole thing right through. I'm a Taoiseach person. I watched it right through, and I was very touched by the way that everybody who took part in it was attempting to relate this, from my point of view, to the Christian gospel. In many ways, it is the funeral of a public figure that I have ever seen, which was overtly and clearly Christian, as indeed, obviously, Margaret...
Well, just on that, if you think they succeeded in doing that, what about, back at that meeting we were talking about on the Mound, her definition of Christianity?
Ah, well, that's a different thing. I don't think her definition of Christianity was the definition of Christianity that the Bishop of London was telling us about, nor indeed in the prayers. I think there was a whole different definition.
Well, just remind me, there was the Good Samaritan thing. That was the famous bit, wasn't it?
Her view, apparently, I think she said, was that the thing about the Good Samaritan was that he had money in order to give it away. Now, that is not and never has been the purpose of the parable. But to go back to the service today, I thought nonetheless people were constantly attempting to address a public figure in relation to the Christian gospel and the way they had tried to work out how their faith and their political will and their political policies matched up. Now, I may have lots of criticisms of Mrs. Thatcher as to whether she succeeded in that, but that she attempted to do so is something I applaud.
Right. And the Bishop of London, he gets an A in diplomacy, if not sermons, doesn't he? For the way he managed to square... well, she didn't quite mean that about society.
I think the Bishop of London always gets an A for diplomacy. He was a rough contemporary of mine at university, and he has always been a very, very good diplomat.
All right. Look, thank you very much indeed, Johnson.